Don't you find that in church circles, when we hear about the word worship, the first thing that comes to our mind is this, right? And then when we read about worship in the scriptures, the first place, and sometimes the only place we want to apply these principles is in that place. Now, of course, this is our corporate place of worship where we get to worship God as the body, communally together. And yes, we are going to apply the principles of worship to that place. But the biblical theme of worship, while it encapsulates that dynamic of worship, it is so much more than that. And one of the things that makes biblical worship true worship is the role of God's Spirit. In fact, Jesus famously says that true worshipers are those who worship in spirit and in truth. And that comes from a very famous story in John chapter 4, where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman, and she comes from this promiscuous background. Jesus asks her to draw him some water. I'm just going through the highlights of the story here. And after some conversation, Jesus moves on from that water to offer her true living water. Now, we've been going through the Spirit Equip series, and I hope when you hear the word living water, lights are just going off. And then Jesus goes a little deeper into her background and shame. He reveals who he is to her. And then it almost seems like she changes the conversation because it's awkward to talk about her background, right? So she goes into a theological question. And she says, well, we in Samaria, we worship at a place called Mount Gerizim. It's just kind of the Samaritan equivalent of Jerusalem. But you Jews, you worship in Jerusalem. If you are this prophet who you say you are, where is the true place to worship? And this is how Jesus responds in verse 21. He says, woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Jesus is saying in this verse that true worship is less about once a year going on the spiritual pilgrimage to this spiritual place because, God's presence is there. He continues to explain in verse 22, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. And so here we see that Jesus is saying, okay, you have been sincere in your worship, but at the end of the day, you've been worshiping in ignorance. And so it very much matters who we're worshiping, not only where we worship. Verse 23, Jesus says, and a time is coming and has now come in him when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. And there is that phrase that we've come to know so well in church circles. Now remember, Jesus is responding to this question from her, which mountain? And so Jesus' answer is not about worship style. He's talking about a time where God's presence is going to be accessible by all worshipers, regardless of where they find themselves. Also, Jesus highlights that true worship is about worshiping the true revealed God, not worshiping in ignorance. And then Jesus continues in verse 24, but God is spirit, and his worshippers must once again worship in spirit and truth. Now, there is so much going on here in this passage, and I don't have time to get into all of these dynamics, but all to say, our worship has to be fueled by the Spirit, directed by the Spirit towards our one true God, who is Jesus Christ, where there is freedom in the Spirit, meaning God's spiritual presence is no longer limited to one geographical place. And this is also going to be a way of enjoying the living water of the eternal life that Jesus wants to give us. In other words, the life of the Spirit. And so as we go into our groups this week, we're going to take this discussion a little bit further about how we can increasingly and intentionally do this, worship our one true God by his Spirit.